The massive cargo ship cut through the orange clouds like a knife through butter as it approached Meridian Station. Inside the passenger compartment sat dozens of people from all walks of life. Some were traders looking for new opportunities. Others were colonists hoping to start fresh on a new world. A few were scientists eager to study the mysteries of this remote station at the edge of known space. Among all these travelers sat two people who would soon find their fates intertwined in ways neither could imagine. Marcus Chen occupied a premium seat near the front of the compartment. He was a man in his late 40s with sun-weathered skin and hands that showed years of hard work, despite his current wealth. Marcus owned vast protein farms across 3 different planets. His agricultural empire produced food for millions of people throughout the sector. When Marcus spoke, people listened. When he entered a room, heads turned. He wore expensive clothes but somehow made them look casual. His boots were genuine leather from Earth. His belt buckle was pure silver from the mines of Callisto. Everything about him screamed success and power. His assistant, Craig Murphy, sat beside him reviewing contracts on a data pad. Craig was younger and nervous. He always seemed to be juggling a dozen tasks at once. 3 other employees traveled with Marcus as well. They were there to handle negotiations and manage the logistics of his visit to Meridian Station. The group talked and laughed loudly. Marcus told stories about his ranching days back on New Texas. The others listened with genuine interest and frequent laughter. Far in the back of the compartment sat Sophie Blake. She was 22 years old with brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were practical and cheap. Government-issued work attire for junior scientists. Sophie clutched her datapad against her chest like a shield. She had been assigned to Meridian Station for a 6-month internship with the xenobiology research team. This was her first real assignment after graduating from university. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Sophie had always been quiet. Even as a child, she preferred observing to participating. While other kids played loudly on the playground, she would sit under a tree and watch insects crawl through the grass. Her teachers often forgot she was in class. Her classmates rarely included her in their groups. It was not that people disliked Sophie. They simply did not notice her. She had learned to be comfortable with invisibility. Or at least she told herself she was comfortable with it. The ship shuddered slightly as it entered the docking sequence. The pilot's voice came over the intercom announcing their arrival. Passengers began gathering their belongings. Marcus stood and stretched. His presence seemed to fill the entire compartment. Sophie remained in her seat waiting for the crowd to thin. She hated pushing through groups of people. The physical proximity made her anxious. So she waited and watched as others filed toward the exit. Meridian Station was huge. The main docking bay could hold a dozen ships the size of the one Sophie had arrived on. The walls were metallic and clean. Everything gleamed under bright artificial lighting. Signs in multiple languages directed newcomers to various checkpoints. Security personnel in blue uniforms watched the crowds with professional detachment. The air smelled recycled and slightly chemical. Sophie took a deep breath and joined the line heading toward customs and medical screening. Medical screening was mandatory for all arrivals. Meridian Station sat near several unexplored planetary systems. The risk of unknown pathogens was real. Every person had to pass through scanning equipment before being allowed into the general population. Sophie watched as Marcus and his group reached the checkpoint ahead of her. The medical technicians smiled broadly when they recognized him. One even asked for an autograph. Marcus obliged with good humor. He joked with them as they ran their scanners over his body. The lead technician barely glanced at the readings before nodding approval. The entire process took less than 2 minutes. Marcus and his people walked through into the main concourse. Sophie found this odd. The screening was supposed to be thorough. She had read the station protocols during her journey. Each scan should take at least 5 minutes to process properly. But she said nothing. Who was she to question the medical staff? Maybe they had faster equipment for VIP arrivals. Maybe she had misunderstood the protocols. When Sophie's turn came, the technician was all business. No smiles or small talk. The scanner hummed as it passed over her body. The technician frowned at the display. He ran the scanner over her again. Then he called over a supervisor. Sophie felt her anxiety spike. Had she brought some contamination with her? Was she sick? The supervisor examined the readings carefully. There was a small bacterial colony showing up in her digestive system. Nothing dangerous. Just some harmless microbes from her last research assignment on Europa. But the technician flagged it anyway. He made notes in the system. He asked Sophie questions about where she had been and what she had been studying. The whole process took 15 minutes. Finally, they cleared her but warned her to report to medical if she experienced any digestive issues. Sophie nodded and thanked them. She grabbed her single bag and hurried into the main concourse. But her mind was already working on the discrepancy she had observed. Marcus Chen had been cleared in 2 minutes with barely a glance at his readings. She had been detained for 15 minutes over harmless bacteria that the scanner had easily identified. The technology was the same. The protocols should have been the same. So why the different treatment? Sophie told herself it did not matter. She was nobody. Marcus Chen was somebody. That was just how the world worked. She had learned that lesson long ago. The invisible people got scrutinized. The powerful people got waved through. It was not fair, but fairness was a childish concept. The universe did not care about fair. Sophie adjusted her bag on her shoulder and headed toward the residential section where her assigned quarters waited. She had work to start tomorrow. She needed to focus on that, not on the uncomfortable questions forming in the back of her analytical mind. Not on the nagging feeling that something had been missed in that too-quick medical screening. She pushed the thoughts away and walked into her new temporary home on Meridian Station. 3 days passed quickly on Meridian Station. Sophie settled into her routine with the xenobiology research team. The laboratory was located in the science wing on Deck 7. It was a quiet space filled with specimen containers and analysis equipment. The other researchers were friendly enough, but mostly kept to themselves. Everyone had their own projects and deadlines. Sophie was assigned to catalog samples from a recent expedition to the southern continent of Meridian Prime. The planet below the station held all sorts of interesting life forms. Her job was to document and classify the microorganisms found in soil and water samples. The work suited her perfectly. She could spend hours peering through microscopes and running chemical analyses. No one expected her to make small talk or attend social gatherings. Her supervisor was a woman named Linda Hayes. Linda was in her 50s with gray hair and a patient demeanor. She checked on Sophie once each morning and otherwise left her alone. Sophie appreciated this arrangement. She was making good progress on the sample catalog. Some of the microorganisms showed interesting properties. She made detailed notes about each one. During her lunch break, Sophie would take her meal to the observation gallery. This was a large room with transparent walls overlooking the station's central hub. From here, she could watch the flow of people below. Merchants conducted business in the open market areas. Travelers hurried between transport terminals. Station workers maintained equipment and cleaned walkways. Sophie found it fascinating to observe human behavior from a distance. She could see patterns that others missed. The way people moved through space. The body language that revealed their moods and intentions. It was like watching a complex organism function. On the 3rd day after her arrival, Sophie sat in her usual spot with a sandwich and a juice container. Below in one of the transparent conference rooms, she spotted Marcus Chen. He was meeting with station officials. Sophie recognized him immediately. His presence was distinctive even from a distance. The meeting appeared to be going well. People were nodding and shaking hands. Contract documents were being passed around the table, but something caught Sophie's attention. Marcus reached for his water glass and his left hand trembled slightly. It was subtle. No one else at the table seemed to notice. But Sophie had sharp eyes trained by years of studying small details. She watched more carefully. Marcus rubbed his temple with his right hand. The gesture looked casual, but Sophie recognized it as a pain response. Someone with a headache trying to ease the pressure. She continued observing throughout her lunch break. Marcus exhibited the tremor twice more. Each time he seemed unaware of it. The other people in the meeting certainly did not react. They were too focused on their presentations and documents. Sophie finished her meal slowly. Her mind was already working through possibilities. Tremors could mean many things. Stress was the most common cause. Marcus Chen ran a huge business empire. The pressure would be enormous. Or it could be simple fatigue. Travel between star systems was hard on the body. Even in the best ships, the artificial gravity and recycled air took a toll. Sophie tried to convince herself it was nothing serious. But the memory of that rushed medical screening kept surfacing in her thoughts. What if they had missed something? What if Marcus had brought some pathogen with him, and the cursory scan had failed to detect it? Sophie pulled out her data pad and accessed the station's medical database. She had basic clearance as a research scientist. The database contained information about common illnesses and conditions. She searched for symptoms matching what she had observed. Tremors combined with headaches. The list was long. Stress and fatigue appeared at the top. But there were other possibilities. Neurological conditions, infections, exposure to certain chemicals or radiation. Most of these seemed unlikely. Marcus had shown no symptoms on the ship. This was recent onset, something acquired since arriving at the station, or possibly something that was incubating during the journey. Sophie closed the database and stared out at the conference room below. Marcus was standing now. The meeting was ending. He shook hands with everyone, smiled broadly, seemed perfectly fine except for those small tells that Sophie had noticed. She wondered if she should report her observations. But to whom? The medical staff had already cleared him. They were professionals with years of training. She was a junior intern who had been on the station for 3 days. They would probably laugh at her. Or worse, they would think she was trying to get attention by making false concerns about a wealthy, important man. Sophie decided to stay silent. She had no proof of anything wrong. Just a couple of minor observations that could be explained away easily. She gathered her trash and returned to the laboratory. The afternoon passed in careful documentation of sample organisms. But her concentration was not what it should have been. Her mind kept drifting back to Marcus Chen and those tremors. She made herself focus on the work. Science required attention to detail. She could not let herself be distracted by unfounded worries. That evening, Sophie returned to her quarters. The room was small but functional. A bed, a desk, a bathroom. Standard accommodations for junior staff. She prepared a simple dinner from ration packs and sat at her desk eating, while she reviewed her notes from the day. But she found herself accessing the station's public information network instead. She searched for news about Marcus Chen. There was plenty of coverage. He was apparently investing in the station's agricultural development, planning to build new protein farms on Meridian Prime. The articles praised his business acumen and generous nature. Several mentioned charitable foundations he funded. He seemed like a genuinely good man, not just wealthy but using his wealth to help others. This made Sophie feel worse about her observations. If something was wrong with him, she should speak up. But if she was mistaken, she would embarrass herself and possibly cause problems for him. The anxiety of social interaction paralyzed her. She had always struggled with this, knowing the right thing to do but being too afraid to do it. She closed her data pad and lay down on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The station's life support systems hummed quietly around her. She could hear muffled voices from neighboring quarters. People living their lives without the crippling self-doubt that plagued her every decision. Sophie eventually fell asleep, but her dreams were troubled. She kept seeing Marcus Chen's trembling hand reaching for that water glass. In the dream, the glass shattered. Water and blood mixed on the conference table. She woke several times during the night. Each time she told herself it was nothing. Just stress from starting a new assignment. Just her overactive imagination finding problems where none existed. By morning, she had almost convinced herself to forget the whole thing. Almost, but not quite. The analytical part of her brain would not let go of the discrepancy between Marcus's quick clearance and her own thorough screening. Something about that difference bothered her deeply. Something felt wrong even if she could not articulate exactly what it was. By the end of the first week, Sophie had fallen into a comfortable rhythm with her work. The sample cataloging was proceeding well. She had documented over 200 different microorganisms from the Southern Continent expedition. Some showed promising properties for potential medical applications. Linda Hayes praised her attention to detail and thorough documentation. Sophie felt good about her contributions even if they were small. This was exactly the kind of work she had hoped to do. Quiet, methodical, important in its own way. But she could not stop thinking about Marcus Chen. The station's gossip network was active as always. People talked constantly about everything and everyone. Sophie rarely participated in these conversations, but she listened carefully. That was another advantage of being invisible. People spoke freely around her as if she were not there. She learned that Marcus had canceled a major meeting 3 days ago. Apparently, he had developed severe headaches. The gossip varied on details, but everyone agreed he was not feeling well. Sophie felt her concern deepen. The tremors she had observed were worsening into something more serious. She wondered if he had sought medical attention. Surely someone as wealthy and important as Marcus Chen would have access to the best doctors on the station. They would figure out what was wrong. They had to. Sophie tried to reassure herself with this logic, but the nagging doubt remained. What if they were looking in the wrong places? What if that rushed initial screening had set them on the wrong path? On the 8th day after her arrival, Sophie heard more concerning news. Marcus Chen had returned to the medical bay. His assistant, Craig Murphy, had insisted on a full examination. The doctors had run comprehensive scans, blood work, neural imaging, everything. According to the gossip, the results showed nothing unusual. The diagnosis was stress-related illness. Too much pressure from business negotiations. The doctors prescribed strong pain medication and ordered rest. Marcus had returned to his luxury suite in the station's VIP section. He was told to take a few days off from meetings and let his body recover. Sophie was in the laboratory when she heard this news. 2 technicians were discussing it near the sample storage units. They seemed relieved that nothing serious had been found. After all, they said a man like Marcus Chen deserved proper care. The station's reputation depended on keeping important visitors safe and healthy. Sophie said nothing, but her hands were shaking slightly as she prepared her next slide for microscopic examination. Something was very wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The symptoms were escalating, not improving. Headaches turning into migraines. Tremors that must be more pronounced if they had triggered a return visit to medical. That evening, Sophie could not sleep. She lay in her bed thinking about everything she had observed. The rushed initial screening, the tremors and headaches, the comprehensive follow-up that found nothing. Her mind kept circling back to that last point. How could extensive scans find nothing when the symptoms were clearly real and worsening? There had to be an explanation. Either the doctors were missing something, or they were looking for the wrong thing. Sophie got up and sat at her desk. She activated her datapad and began searching medical databases with new focus. She searched for conditions that could evade standard medical scanning. Rare diseases, unusual pathogens, anything that might explain symptoms without showing obvious markers in typical tests. The list was shorter than she expected. Modern medical technology was remarkably thorough. Most conditions left clear traces in blood chemistry or tissue scans. But there were exceptions. Certain parasitic organisms could hide in neural tissue. Some produced proteins that masked their presence from scanners. Others mimicked natural body chemistry so closely that they appeared as normal cellular activity. Sophie began cross-referencing these rare conditions with Marcus Chen's travel history. She had to make some assumptions here. She did not have access to his personal records. But the news articles about his visit mentioned he had recently inspected agricultural operations on several frontier worlds. Frontier worlds meant less developed medical infrastructure, higher exposure to unknown organisms, greater risk of picking up something unusual. Sophie made a list of the planets mentioned in the articles. Then she searched for documented cases of parasitic infections from those regions. Hours passed. Sophie's eyes burned from staring at her screen. She drank coffee from her small maker and kept searching. Most of what she found was irrelevant. Common illnesses easily treated. Nothing that matched the symptom pattern. But then she stumbled across something interesting. A case study from a mining colony on a planet called Kepler 442b. Workers there had contracted a parasitic organism native to that world. The symptoms included headaches and tremors that progressed to seizures and cognitive decline. The parasite was nearly invisible to standard medical scanners. It hid in neural tissue and produced proteins that masked its presence. Detection required specific enzyme marker tests that were not part of routine screening protocols. Sophie read the entire case study twice. The environmental conditions on Kepler 442b were similar to what she knew about Meridian Prime. Both were temperate worlds with liquid water and carbon-based ecosystems. Both had been only partially explored. The southern continent of Meridian Prime, where the expedition had collected samples, was particularly similar. Forested regions near water sources. Exactly the kind of environment where parasitic organisms thrived. Sophie felt her heart rate increase. This could be it. This could explain everything. She checked the expedition data. The team had collected samples from multiple sites, including several near rivers and lakes. If the parasite was present in those samples, then Marcus could have been exposed during the initial processing, or he could have picked it up during a personal visit to the surface. The timeline worked. The incubation period described in the case study was 5 to 7 days. Marcus had arrived 8 days ago. The symptoms had begun appearing 3 days after arrival. That matched perfectly. Sophie sat back in her chair, feeling both excited and terrified. Excited because she might have found the answer. Terrified because if she was right, Marcus Chen was in serious danger. The case study made clear that without proper treatment, the parasite would cause permanent brain damage within 2 weeks. Death would follow shortly after. Marcus had already lost a week. If the doctors continued treating him for stress, he would run out of time. Someone had to tell them. Someone had to make them look for this specific parasite using the right diagnostic tests. But who would believe her? Sophie was a junior intern with barely a week of experience on the station. The medical staff were trained professionals who had already examined Marcus thoroughly. They had found nothing wrong beyond stress. If she went to them with this theory, they would dismiss her. They would think she was overstepping her expertise, trying to play doctor when she had no medical training. The social anxiety that had plagued Sophie her entire life came rushing back. She could imagine the scornful looks, the polite but firm dismissal, the embarrassment of being wrong in front of people who outranked her in every way. Sophie looked at the time. It was 4 in the morning. She had been researching for nearly 6 hours. Her body ached from sitting in one position. Her mind felt foggy from exhaustion and too much coffee. But underneath the fatigue was a growing certainty. She was right about this. Every instinct she had honed through years of careful observation told her she was right. Marcus Chen did not have a stress-related illness. He had a parasitic infection that was slowly destroying his brain. And if she did not find the courage to speak up, he would die. The thought made her feel sick. She had always been good at staying silent, at making herself invisible, at avoiding confrontation and difficult conversations. But this time silence meant death. This time being invisible meant letting a good man suffer needlessly. Sophie closed her datapad and made a decision. Tomorrow, she would go to the medical bay and present her findings. Sophie barely slept that night. When her alarm went off at 7, she felt exhausted but determined. She showered and dressed carefully in her cleanest work clothes. She wanted to appear professional and competent even if she did not feel that way inside. Her hands shook as she gathered her research notes and downloaded them to a portable data card. Everything she had found about the parasite from Kepler 442b was now organized in a clear presentation. Environmental comparisons, symptom timelines, diagnostic protocols. She had spent an extra hour that morning making sure everything was easy to understand. The last thing she wanted was for her findings to be dismissed because of poor presentation. Breakfast was impossible. Her stomach was tied in knots. Sophie managed a few sips of juice before giving up. She arrived at the laboratory earlier than usual. Linda Hayes was already there reviewing data from another project. Sophie approached her supervisor's desk feeling like she was walking toward an execution. Her mouth was dry. Her palms were sweaty. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around and forget the whole thing. But she forced herself forward one step at a time. Linda looked up with a smile. Sophie managed to explain that she needed time away from the lab today. She had to visit the medical bay about an urgent matter. Linda's expression shifted to concern. Was Sophie feeling ill? Did she need medical attention? Sophie shook her head. It was not about her. It was about Marcus Chen. She thought she knew what was wrong with him. Linda's eyebrows rose in surprise. She asked Sophie to explain. So Sophie did. She laid out her observations and her research. She showed the case study from Kepler 442b. She explained the environmental parallels and the symptom progression. Linda listened carefully. Unlike what Sophie had feared, her supervisor did not laugh or dismiss her concerns. Instead, Linda asked thoughtful questions. She examined the data Sophie had compiled. She pulled up the expedition sample logs and cross-referenced them with Sophie's findings. After 20 minutes, Linda sat back in her chair with a serious expression. This was solid work. The theory was sound. The evidence was compelling. Sophie needed to get this information to the medical staff immediately. But Linda warned her that it would not be easy. Doctors did not like being told they had missed something, especially by someone outside their field. Sophie would need to be prepared for resistance and skepticism. Sophie nodded. She had expected as much, but with Linda's support she felt slightly more confident. Her supervisor offered to come with her, but Sophie declined. This was something she needed to do herself. Linda squeezed her shoulder and wished her luck. Sophie left the laboratory and headed toward the medical bay. The walk felt longer than it actually was. Every step required conscious effort. Her anxiety was overwhelming, but she kept thinking about Marcus Chen, about the timeline, about how little time remained before permanent damage occurred. That thought drove her forward. The medical bay occupied an entire section of Deck 3. It was clean and modern with the latest equipment. Sophie had been here only once before for her arrival screening. Now she approached the main reception desk with her data card clutched in one hand. The receptionist was a young man with a bored expression. He looked up when Sophie stopped in front of him. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. She needed to speak with someone about Marcus Chen's condition. She had information about his illness. The receptionist's expression shifted to mild annoyance. Was she family? No. Was she part of his staff? No. Then what was her relationship to the patient? Sophie explained that she was a xenobiologist with the research team. She believed Marcus had been misdiagnosed. She had evidence of a parasitic infection that required immediate attention. The receptionist sighed. He had clearly dealt with concerned citizens before. The patient was under the care of the station's chief medical officer. If Sophie wanted to submit a formal consultation request, she could fill out the proper forms. The process would take several days for review. Sophie felt panic rising. Several days was too long. Marcus did not have several days. She needed to speak with someone now. Today. The receptionist looked unmoved. Policy was policy. He could not just let anyone walk in and demand to see a doctor. Sophie's anxiety was transforming into something else. Desperation. She leaned forward and lowered her voice. She told him that if he did not get her in front of a doctor immediately, Marcus Chen would die. She was not exaggerating. She was not being dramatic. The man had a parasitic organism destroying his brain. Every hour of delay increased the damage. The receptionist must have heard something in her tone because his expression changed. He picked up his communication device and spoke quietly into it. 5 minutes later, a doctor appeared. Her name was Helen Cruz, according to her badge. She was in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Sophie could see the impatience in her eyes. Dr. Cruz led Sophie to a small consultation room. The door closed behind them. The doctor gestured for Sophie to sit. Then she crossed her arms and asked Sophie to explain why she was claiming Marcus Chen had been misdiagnosed. Her tone was polite but cold. This was clearly an inconvenience. Sophie handed over the data card. She explained her observations, starting with the rushed initial screening, the tremors she had noticed, the progression of symptoms. Then she presented the case study from Kepler 442b. She walked Dr. Cruz through the environmental parallels, the symptom matching, the diagnostic protocols that could confirm her theory. She spoke carefully and clearly. She had practiced this presentation in her mind dozens of times. She made sure to cite sources and acknowledge the limits of her expertise. She was not trying to tell the doctors how to do their job. She was simply bringing new information to their attention. Dr. Cruz listened without interrupting. When Sophie finished, the doctor spent several minutes reviewing the data card. Sophie sat in silence, watching for any reaction. Finally, Dr. Cruz looked up. Her expression had softened slightly, but skepticism remained. She appreciated Sophie's concern. Really, she did. But Marcus Chen had been thoroughly examined by the station's best physicians. They had run every standard test. They had found no evidence of infection or parasitic organisms. Nothing in his blood work suggested anything unusual. His neural scans showed some minor inflammation consistent with stress, but nothing parasitic. Sophie had anticipated this response. She explained that this particular parasite would not show up on standard tests. That was the whole point. It hid in neural tissue and produced masking proteins. The doctors would not find it unless they specifically looked for it using targeted enzyme marker tests. Those tests were not part of routine screening. They had to be ordered specifically based on suspicion of this exact organism. Dr. Cruz frowned. Those tests were expensive. They took time to process. The medical bay could not order them based on speculation from an intern with no medical training. The words stung, but Sophie pushed past the hurt. She had expected resistance. She forced herself to stay calm and rational. She asked if she could at least examine the expedition samples from the southern continent. If the parasite was present in those specimens, it would support her theory. It would give the medical team concrete evidence to justify the expensive tests. Dr. Cruz considered this. It was a reasonable request. It would not cost the medical bay anything. If Sophie wanted to spend her time running tests on soil samples, that was her choice. Fine. Run the tests. If she found something concrete, she should bring it back. But until then, the medical team would continue treating Marcus Chen according to their professional judgment. Sophie agreed. It was not everything she wanted, but it was something. She had permission to investigate. She had a path forward. Dr. Cruz stood indicating the meeting was over. Sophie thanked her and left the consultation room. Her legs felt weak. Her whole body was shaking from the adrenaline, but she had done it. She had spoken up. She had presented her case to a doctor despite every instinct telling her to stay quiet. Now came the hard part. She had to prove she was right. She had to find that parasite in the expedition samples, because if she was wrong about this, Marcus Chen would continue receiving ineffective treatment. And if she was right but could not prove it, the result would be the same. Sophie headed back toward the laboratory with renewed determination. She had work to do and very little time to do it. Sophie returned to the laboratory with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. The fear and anxiety were still there, but they were background noise now. She had a mission. She had to find evidence of the parasite before it was too late for Marcus Chen. Linda Hayes looked up when Sophie entered. The supervisor could see the determination on her intern's face. Sophie explained what had happened at the medical bay. Dr. Cruz had given her permission to test the expedition samples. If she found the parasite, the medical team would take her seriously. Linda immediately offered to help. Together they could cover more ground faster. Sophie was grateful but also worried. This was her theory. If she was wrong, she did not want to drag Linda down with her. But Linda waved off those concerns. Science was collaborative. If Sophie was right, this could save a man's life. If she was wrong, they would have wasted a few hours on extra tests. That was acceptable risk. Linda cleared her schedule for the day. She instructed the other lab workers to handle routine tasks. Then she and Sophie got to work. The expedition had collected over 200 samples from the southern continent. Most were soil and water specimens, but there were also plant materials and organic debris. Sophie and Linda focused on samples collected near water sources. The case study from Kepler 442b indicated the parasite thrived in moist environments. They pulled every relevant sample from storage. The containers were small and labeled with collection coordinates. Sophie had already cataloged many of these, but she had not been looking for parasites during that initial work. Now she needed to run specialized tests. The diagnostic protocol from the case study required enzyme marker analysis. This was more complex than standard microscopy. Sophie had to prepare each sample carefully. Extract organic material, break down cellular walls, apply specific chemical reagents, then run the mixture through the analyzer and wait for results. Each test took approximately 45 minutes. With 2 of them working, they could process maybe 25 samples in a full day. Sophie did the math in her head. 200 samples would take 8 days working around the clock. They did not have 8 days. Linda suggested they narrow the focus even further. Look at the collection dates and locations. Find samples most likely to contain the parasite. Sophie pulled up the expedition logs. The team had spent 2 weeks on the southern continent. They had visited multiple sites, but concentrated their efforts near a large lake system. The lake was surrounded by dense forest. Perfect habitat for parasitic organisms. Sophie and Linda selected every sample collected within 5 kilometers of that lake. That reduced the number to 47 specimens. Much more manageable. They worked through the morning without stopping. Sophie prepared samples while Linda ran the analyzer. They developed an efficient rhythm. Each test required careful attention, but they moved as quickly as possible. The first 10 samples came back negative. No enzyme markers detected. Sophie felt her confidence wavering. What if she was wrong? What if this was just stress and she was wasting everyone's time? But Linda encouraged her to keep going. Negative results were still results. They were eliminating possibilities. By lunchtime, they had tested 20 samples. All negative. Sophie's hands were cramping from the repetitive preparation work. Her eyes burned from staring at readouts. But she refused to take a break. Every minute counted. Linda insisted they at least eat something. She ordered food delivered to the lab. They ate quickly while sample 21 processed. Sophie barely tasted the food. Her entire focus was on the analyzer display waiting for results. Sample 21 was negative. So were 22 and 23. Sophie felt despair creeping in. Maybe the parasite was not in these samples. Maybe Marcus had been exposed somewhere else. Maybe her entire theory was built on coincidence and wishful thinking. Sample 24 began processing. Sophie watched the analyzer screen. The chemical reactions were visible as colored bands shifting across the display. Different compounds produced different patterns. A clean sample would show a simple baseline. An infected sample would show specific enzyme markers as additional bands. The display flickered. New bands appeared. Sophie leaned closer. Her heart rate spiked. She checked the reference patterns from the case study. The bands matched perfectly. The enzyme markers were exactly what the protocol predicted. Sample 24 was positive. Sophie called Linda over. They both stared at the display. Linda ran the calibration check to make sure there was no equipment error. The analyzer was functioning correctly. The result was valid. They had found it. The parasite was real and it was present in the expedition samples. Sophie wanted to run immediately to the medical bay, but Linda stopped her. One positive result was good but not conclusive. They needed to confirm with multiple samples. False positives were rare but possible. They had to be absolutely certain before making claims that would affect patient treatment. Sophie understood. She forced herself to slow down and focus. They continued testing. Sample 25 was negative, but 26 came back positive. So did sample 31. By late afternoon, they had tested all 47 priority samples. 3 showed positive for the parasitic enzyme markers, 3 independent confirmations. That was solid evidence. Linda examined the positive samples under high magnification. The parasite itself was microscopic, almost crystalline in structure. It looked like tiny geometric shapes clustered in the organic material. Beautiful in a strange way, but deadly if it entered a human host. Linda took detailed images and added them to Sophie's data package. They now had visual confirmation along with the chemical markers. This was irrefutable proof that the organism existed in the environment Marcus Chen had been exposed to. Sophie organized all the data into a comprehensive report. She included the timeline of Marcus's symptoms, the environmental analysis, the case study from Kepler 442b, the test results from the expedition samples, the microscopic images. Everything was clear and well documented. Linda reviewed the report and suggested a few additions. They needed to emphasize the urgency. The case study indicated permanent brain damage began after 2 weeks of infection. Marcus was already 9 days into that timeline. He had maybe 5 days before irreversible harm occurred. Possibly less depending on individual factors. By early evening, the report was complete. Sophie saved it to a new data card. Her hands were shaking again, but this time from exhaustion and excitement rather than fear. She had done it. She had found proof. Now the medical team would have to listen. They would have to run the proper diagnostic tests on Marcus. They would find the parasite in his neural tissue. Treatment could begin immediately. Sophie allowed herself a moment of hope. Maybe she really had figured this out in time. Maybe Marcus Chen would be okay. Linda insisted on accompanying Sophie to the medical bay this time. She wanted to add her authority as a senior researcher to Sophie's findings. Sophie was grateful for the support. They walked together through the station corridors. The evening shift had begun. Fewer people were around. The lighting had dimmed slightly to simulate nighttime. Sophie clutched the data card like a lifeline. Everything depended on what happened in the next hour. Either the doctors would accept this evidence and save Marcus, or they would find some reason to dismiss it, and he would continue deteriorating. They arrived at the medical bay and requested an immediate meeting with Dr. Cruz. The receptionist recognized Sophie from that morning. He seemed more respectful this time. Perhaps Linda's presence helped. Or perhaps word had spread about the persistent intern making claims about Marcus Chen. Either way, they were shown to a proper examination room rather than a small consultation space. Dr. Cruz arrived within minutes. Her expression was guarded. She remembered Sophie clearly. She looked at Linda with professional courtesy. Linda introduced herself and explained that she was here to support Sophie's findings. Sophie handed over the new data card. She explained what they had found. The positive tests, the microscopic images, the 3 independent confirmations. She walked Dr. Cruz through the entire evidence package. Linda added technical details where appropriate. They presented their case methodically and thoroughly. This was not speculation anymore. This was hard science. They had found the parasite in environmental samples that Marcus had been exposed to. The probability that he was infected was extremely high. He needed immediate testing and treatment. Dr. Cruz reviewed everything carefully. She spent nearly 30 minutes examining the data. She asked technical questions about the testing methodology. She verified the reference protocols from the case study. She looked at the microscopic images from multiple angles. Sophie and Linda answered every question patiently. They had done the work correctly. The evidence spoke for itself. Finally, Dr. Cruz looked up. Her expression had changed. The skepticism was gone. In its place was professional concern and perhaps a hint of respect. She would take this to the chief medical officer immediately. They would run the enzyme marker tests on Marcus Chen tonight. If the results confirmed infection, they would begin treatment within hours. She thanked Sophie for her persistence and her careful research. This could very well save the patient's life. Marcus Chen was not a man who forgot debts or overlooked talent. Even lying in a medical bay bed recovering from a parasitic infection that had nearly killed him, he was thinking about the future. He looked at Sophie Blake standing nervously beside his bed and saw something valuable, not just someone who had saved his life, but someone with a rare combination of skills. Attention to detail, analytical thinking, the courage to speak up when it mattered. These were qualities his organization desperately needed. His agricultural empire spanned multiple worlds. He employed thousands of people, managed complex operations in dozens of different environments, and every one of those environments carried risks, unknown organisms, untested conditions, potential dangers that standard protocols might miss. He had nearly died because standard medical protocols had failed, because the initial screening had been rushed and cursory, because no one had thought to look deeper. This could have been prevented, should have been prevented, but it was not until Sophie Blake paid attention that anyone noticed something was wrong. That kind of vigilant observation could save countless lives if applied systematically. Marcus made his decision quickly. He wanted Sophie to work for him, not as an intern or junior researcher, as the head of a new division dedicated to xenobiological safety across all his operations. Sophie stared at him when he explained this. She thought he must be joking or still confused from the medication. But Marcus was completely serious. Craig pulled up a contract on his datapad. The salary was more than Sophie currently made in a year. Actually, it was more than she would make in 5 years at her current level. The position came with full authority to develop safety protocols, to hire a research team, to investigate any potential threats across the entire Chen agricultural network. She would have resources, support, the ability to make real changes that would protect workers and colonists throughout the sector. Sophie did not know what to say. This was overwhelming. She had been on Meridian Station for barely 2 weeks. She was still an intern. She had no experience managing people or developing organizational policies. She tried to explain this, but Marcus waved off her concerns. He did not need someone with management experience. He needed someone who saw what others missed, someone who followed through even when it was difficult or uncomfortable, someone who cared more about being right than being liked. Sophie had demonstrated all of those qualities. Everything else could be learned or delegated. Craig added that the position would be based wherever Sophie wanted. She could work from Meridian Station if she liked it here, or relocate to New Texas where the company headquarters was located, or travel between different facilities conducting on-site inspections. The role was flexible because the work was new. Sophie would essentially be creating the position from scratch, defining what xenobiological safety meant in a practical corporate context. It was a huge opportunity, a chance to shape something important. Craig could see Sophie was hesitant. He understood this was a big decision. He told her to take time to think about it. Talk to her current supervisor. Consider what she really wanted from her career. Sophie thanked them both and promised to think carefully. She left the medical bay in a daze. Her mind could not process what had just happened. An hour ago, she had been a junior intern cataloging soil samples. Now she had been offered a senior position with one of the largest agricultural companies in the sector. It did not feel real. She walked back to the laboratory without seeing where she was going. Her feet carried her on autopilot while her thoughts spun in circles. Linda was working late when Sophie arrived. The supervisor took one look at Sophie's face and asked what happened. Sophie explained everything. The job offer, the salary, the scope of responsibility. Linda listened without interrupting. When Sophie finished, Linda sat back in her chair with a thoughtful expression. This was an incredible opportunity, the kind of position most researchers dreamed about. Sophie would have real resources and real authority to make changes. She could protect people, prevent future incidents like what had happened to Marcus. It was meaningful work, important work, but Linda also understood why Sophie was hesitant. This would mean leaving research. Sophie loved the quiet, methodical nature of laboratory work. She loved discovering new organisms and documenting their properties. The position Marcus offered was different. It would involve management and corporate politics, dealing with people constantly, making decisions that affected thousands of workers. For someone as introverted as Sophie, that sounded exhausting. Linda asked what Sophie's gut told her. What did she really want? Sophie admitted she did not know. Part of her wanted to stay exactly where she was, continue her internship, eventually get a permanent research position, spend her career studying microorganisms in peaceful laboratories. That life appealed to her. It was safe and predictable. But another part of her remembered how it felt to solve the puzzle of Marcus's illness, to find the answer when everyone else had given up, to know that her work had directly saved a life. That felt significant in a way that cataloging samples never would. She had made a real difference. Maybe that was worth stepping outside her comfort zone. Linda suggested Sophie talk to other people before deciding. Get different perspectives. Sophie reached out to her former professors. She called her parents. She even spoke with Dr. Cruz, who had observed Sophie throughout the whole situation. Everyone had opinions. Her professors thought she should take the job. It was rare for someone so young to be offered this kind of responsibility. Her parents were worried. They knew how much Sophie struggled with social anxiety. They feared the pressure would be too much for her. Dr. Cruz was pragmatic. She pointed out that Sophie could always return to research if the corporate position did not work out. But she might never get another opportunity like this. Sophie spent 3 days thinking. She made lists of pros and cons. She tried to imagine herself in the role Marcus had described. Leading a team, developing protocols, traveling to different facilities. It scared her, but it also excited her in a way nothing else ever had. She realized that she had been hiding in laboratories her whole life. Not because she loved research so much, but because it was safe. Because being invisible meant never having to risk failure or rejection. The position Marcus offered would make her very visible. She would have to interact with people constantly, make presentations, defend her decisions, face criticism and pushback. All the things she had spent her life avoiding. But maybe that was exactly why she should do it. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. She had found her voice during the crisis with Marcus. She had spoken up despite her fear. She had pushed through anxiety and self-doubt because someone's life depended on it. That strength was inside her. She had proved it. Maybe she could learn to access that strength more regularly. Maybe she could become the kind of person who did not need a crisis to speak up. The kind of person who led rather than observed. The thought terrified her, but it also felt right somehow. Like a challenge she was finally ready to face. Sophie made her decision on a quiet evening in her quarters. She sat at her desk and drafted a formal acceptance message to Craig Murphy. She kept it brief and professional. She accepted the position as head of xenobiological safety for Chen Agricultural Enterprises. She requested a start date in 1 month to allow her to complete her current commitments and prepare for the transition. She thanked Marcus for the opportunity and promised to do her best to justify his faith in her. Then she sent the message before she could talk herself out of it. The response came within minutes. Craig was delighted. Marcus was still recovering, but he had been hoping Sophie would accept. They would begin preparing everything for her arrival at the new Texas headquarters. Craig would send detailed information about the role and what resources would be available. Sophie could start building her team immediately. They would support whatever she needed. Sophie closed her communication device and sat in silence. She had just changed the entire trajectory of her life. Tomorrow she would tell Linda. She would begin wrapping up her work on Meridian Station. She would prepare for a future that looked nothing like what she had imagined just 2 weeks ago. But tonight she just sat quietly and let the magnitude of the decision sink in. She was scared. She was excited. She was uncertain about her ability to succeed. But she was also ready. Ready to step out of the shadows. Ready to use her gifts in ways that mattered. Ready to become someone who did more than observe. Someone who acted. Someone who made a difference. Sophie Blake, the invisible intern, was about to become Sophie Blake, the safety director. And somehow, despite all her doubts and fears, that felt exactly right. The final month on Meridian Station passed both quickly and slowly. Sophie finished cataloging the expedition samples. She wrote detailed reports on her findings, including extensive documentation of the parasitic organism. Her work would be published in xenobiology journals. Other researchers would use it to develop better screening protocols for frontier worlds. Linda helped her prepare several papers for submission. They worked together on the technical writing. Sophie found she enjoyed this process, taking complex findings and making them clear for other scientists. It was still research, but with practical applications. A bridge between the laboratory and the real world. Marcus recovered steadily. The anti-parasitic treatment was completely successful. The organism was eliminated from his neural tissue. Physical therapy helped him regain most of the motor control in his left arm. A slight tremor remained, but doctors said it would likely fade with time. He was cleared to leave the medical bay after 3 weeks. He immediately returned to work negotiating deals and managing his empire. But he was different now. More cautious. More aware of risks. He checked in regularly with Sophie, asking questions about safety protocols. He wanted to understand exactly what had gone wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. Sophie visited him several times during her remaining weeks on the station. They discussed the new Xenobiological Safety Division, what it should look like, what resources it would need. Marcus gave her remarkable freedom to design the program herself. He trusted her judgment. This was still strange for Sophie. Being trusted, being valued, having her opinions matter to someone powerful and successful. But she was getting used to it, slowly learning to accept that maybe she really did have something valuable to contribute. Craig Murphy became an unexpected friend during this transition period. He helped Sophie understand the corporate side of Chen Agricultural, the politics and procedures, the way decisions were made. He introduced her to key people via video calls. Department heads and facility managers, people she would be working with soon. Craig coached her on how to present herself, how to communicate confidence even when she felt uncertain. Sophie appreciated his guidance. She knew she had a lot to learn about operating in a corporate environment. Craig made it clear he would support her. Marcus had made xenobiological safety a top priority. That meant Sophie would have significant authority and backing. Linda threw a small farewell party for Sophie on her last day at the laboratory. The research team gathered in the break room. Someone had made a cake. People shared stories and gave speeches. Sophie felt awkward being the center of attention, but also touched by the gesture. These people had accepted her, supported her, believed in her when she barely believed in herself. Linda gave a short speech about recognizing talent. She said Sophie represented the best of what science should be. Careful observation, rigorous analysis, and the courage to speak truth even when it was uncomfortable. The team applauded. Sophie managed to say a few words of thanks, though her voice shook. She would miss this place, the quiet laboratory, the routine work. But she was ready to move forward. The transport ship to New Texas departed early the next morning. Sophie stood in the docking bay with her single bag of belongings. Marcus and Craig were there to see her off. Marcus still moved a bit stiffly but looked healthy. He shook her hand firmly. He told her he was counting on her. The company needed what she could provide. But more than that, he believed she would do great things. Sophie thanked him. She promised to work hard, to build something meaningful. Marcus smiled. He said he had no doubts. Then Craig handed her a data pad. It contained everything she would need. Personnel files, facility locations, budgets, the full scope of Chen Agricultural's operations. Sophie could review it during the journey. Begin planning her approach. The flight to New Texas took 5 days. Sophie spent most of that time studying the datapad. The company was even larger than she had realized. Operations on 14 different planets, over 50,000 employees, countless opportunities for something to go wrong. The scope was daunting. But Sophie broke it down methodically. She identified high-risk facilities, places where exposure to unknown organisms was most likely. She prioritized those for initial inspection. She drafted protocols for medical screening, better than what Meridian Station had used, more thorough, less likely to miss rare pathogens. She outlined training programs for facility managers, ways to recognize early warning signs of biological threats. By the time the ship arrived at New Texas, Sophie had a comprehensive plan, a roadmap for the first year. She felt more confident now. This was still scary. She was still anxious about managing people in corporate politics, but she knew her subject matter. She understood the science. That was a solid foundation to build on. The rest she would learn as she went. Craig had sent messages during the journey. Her office was ready. Her initial budget was approved. She could begin hiring team members immediately. 3 positions to start: a microbiologist, a medical researcher, a data analyst. Sophie had already drafted job descriptions. She knew what skills she needed. New Texas was a beautiful planet, mostly agricultural with vast open spaces. The Chen Agricultural Headquarters was located in the capital city. A gleaming tower that housed executive offices and central operations. Sophie's transport landed at the private spaceport. Craig was waiting with a company vehicle. He greeted her warmly and helped with her bag. The drive to headquarters took 30 minutes. Craig pointed out landmarks and explained the local culture. New Texas had been settled by ranchers and farmers from Earth. People here valued hard work and practical solutions. They respected competence over credentials. Sophie liked that. She might not have fancy degrees or years of experience, but she could demonstrate competence through results. Her office was on the 20th floor, with a view of the surrounding farmland. It was larger than any workspace she had ever had. A desk, conference table, shelves for books and equipment. Craig showed her around, introduced her to the executive assistant who would support her work, explained the building systems and security protocols. Sophie felt overwhelmed again, but in a good way. This was real. She had a position of real authority, resources to accomplish meaningful goals, people who would listen when she spoke. It was everything she had never dared to dream of. Marcus stopped by her office that afternoon. He looked completely recovered now, strong and commanding as ever. He welcomed her officially to the company, told her his door was always open if she needed anything. Then he said something that stuck with Sophie. He told her that the galaxy was full of invisible people doing important work that no one noticed. Scientists, technicians, workers who paid attention to details. These people kept civilization running, but too often they were overlooked, dismissed, their concerns ignored. He did not want that in his company. He wanted a culture where people like Sophie felt empowered to speak up, where observation and analysis were valued as much as charisma and confidence. Sophie understood what he meant. She had been invisible her whole life, overlooked because she was quiet, because she did not demand attention. But being invisible had given her the ability to see things others missed, to notice the symptoms everyone else overlooked. That perspective was valuable. Maybe being on the sidelines was not a weakness after all. Maybe the people watching from the edges saw the clearest picture. Marcus had learned that lesson the hard way, nearly dying because people were too busy to pay attention, too confident in their first impressions, too willing to overlook details that did not fit their expectations. Sophie spent her first week meeting with department heads and reviewing safety protocols across the company. She found gaps everywhere, not because people were negligent, but because xenobiological safety was new territory. No one had systematically thought about the risks of working across multiple alien biospheres. They used standard medical screening, basic protective equipment, generic emergency procedures. None of it was designed for the specific challenges of frontier agriculture. Sophie began drafting new protocols, more comprehensive, tailored to different planetary environments. She consulted with experts, read every case study she could find, built databases of known organisms and potential threats. Hiring her team took 2 weeks. She interviewed dozens of candidates, finally selected 3 excellent researchers, people who shared her methodical approach and attention to detail. Together they began the real work. Visiting facilities, inspecting operations, training workers, developing response plans for potential biological incidents. It was exhausting. Sophie had to push herself constantly to interact with strangers, to lead meetings, to present findings to skeptical managers, but she got better at it. With each facility visit, she felt more confident, more comfortable in her authority. The anxiety never disappeared completely, but it became manageable, something she could work through rather than something that paralyzed her. 6 months after starting the position, Sophie returned to Meridian Station for a conference. She had been invited to present her work on parasitic organism detection. The medical bay wanted to implement her improved screening protocols. Dr. Cruz met her at the station. They had stayed in contact. The doctor had become something of a mentor. Sophie could not go home after leaving the medical bay. She was too wound up to sleep or rest. Linda suggested they get dinner together at one of the station's cafeterias. Sophie agreed, even though she still had no appetite. They found a quiet corner away from the main crowds. Linda ordered food for both of them. Sophie picked at a plate of vegetables while her mind raced through everything that might happen next. The doctors would test Marcus. They would either find the parasite or they would not. If they found it, she would be vindicated. If they did not find it, she would look foolish. Worse than foolish, she would have caused unnecessary panic and wasted medical resources on a false alarm. Linda seemed to sense Sophie's spiral of anxiety. The older woman reached across the table and patted Sophie's hand. She reminded Sophie that she had done everything right. She had made careful observations. She had researched thoroughly. She had found concrete evidence. The outcome was now out of her control. All she could do was wait. Sophie nodded, but waiting had never been her strength. When you spent your whole life being invisible, you learned to control what little you could. Now she had no control at all. The situation belonged to doctors and medical equipment, and the tiny parasite that might or might not be destroying Marcus Chen's brain. They finished their meal slowly. Linda talked about her own early career, the mistakes she had made, the times she had been wrong and the times she had been right, but no one listened. She told Sophie that doubt was part of science. You could do everything correctly and still fail, but you could also succeed in ways you never expected. The key was to keep trying. Keep observing. Keep asking questions. Sophie appreciated the attempt at comfort, even if it did not fully calm her nerves. They parted ways outside the cafeteria. Linda headed home. Sophie wandered the station corridors, not ready to face her empty quarters yet. She ended up back at the observation gallery, her usual lunch spot, the place where she had first noticed Marcus Chen's tremors. The central hub below was quieter now. Evening shift meant reduced activity. Maintenance crews cleaned walkways. A few late shoppers browsed the market stalls. Sophie sat in the same chair she always used and stared out at the space. She wondered where Marcus was right now. Probably in the medical bay undergoing tests, or maybe back in his suite waiting for results. She wondered if he was scared, if he knew how sick he might be. If anyone had told him that an intern he had never met was the reason for all these new tests. Her communication device buzzed. Sophie jumped. She pulled it from her pocket and saw a message from Dr. Cruz. The tests were complete. They had found the parasite. The enzyme markers were present in Marcus Chen's neural tissue at significant levels. The infection was advanced, more extensive than they had hoped. But it was treatable. They were beginning anti-parasitic therapy immediately. Dr. Cruz thanked Sophie again for her diligence. Without her intervention, Marcus would have died within a week. Sophie read the message 3 times. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she felt dizzy. She had been right. She had actually been right. And more importantly, Marcus was going to receive proper treatment. Sophie allowed herself a few minutes to process this. Then she sent a brief reply thanking Dr. Cruz for taking her concerns seriously. She copied the message to Linda, who responded almost immediately with congratulations and relief. Sophie sat in the observation gallery for another hour. She felt strange, lighter somehow. The anxiety that had driven her for days was gone. In its place was a quiet satisfaction. She had made a difference. Her observations had mattered. For someone who spent her whole life trying to be invisible, this was a profound shift. She had been seen. Her voice had been heard. The outcome had been positive. Eventually, Sophie returned to her quarters. She managed to sleep properly for the first time in days. No anxious dreams. No waking up in panic. Just deep, restful sleep. When her alarm went off the next morning, she felt renewed. She showered and dressed and headed to the laboratory, ready to resume her regular work. Linda greeted her with a hug. The other lab workers had heard about what happened. They congratulated Sophie and asked questions about the parasite. Sophie answered briefly. She did not want to make a big deal of it. She was ready to get back to normal routine, but normal routine proved elusive. Word had spread through the station about the intern who had saved Marcus Chen's life. People Sophie had never met nodded to her in corridors. Strangers thanked her for her work. It was overwhelming. Sophie did not know how to handle attention. She had spent 22 years avoiding it. Now it was unavoidable. She tried to focus on her sample cataloging, but interruptions were constant. Other researchers wanted to hear about her diagnostic process. Medical students asked if she would give a presentation on the case. Even station administrators sent messages of appreciation. 3 days after treatment began, Dr. Cruz contacted Sophie directly. Marcus was responding well to the anti-parasitic medication. The infection was being cleared from his neural tissue. He would need ongoing therapy to repair the damage, but the prognosis was excellent. He would make a full recovery. Craig Murphy had been informed and wanted to meet with Sophie. Marcus himself had asked to see her once he was strong enough. Dr. Cruz invited Sophie to visit the medical bay and observe the treatment process. She said Sophie had earned the right to see the results of her discovery. Sophie accepted the invitation nervously. She had never been comfortable in hospitals or medical settings. Too many people, too much activity. But curiosity won over anxiety. She wanted to understand how the treatment worked. Dr. Cruz met her at the medical bay entrance and led her to a secure treatment room. Through a transparent wall, Sophie could see Marcus Chen. He was unconscious. Medical equipment surrounded his bed. Tubes and wires connected to various parts of his body. Dr. Cruz explained that he was being kept sedated during the intensive phase of treatment. The anti-parasitic compound had to be carefully dosed to kill the organism without damaging neural tissue. It was a delicate process. Sophie watched through the glass. This was the man she had observed from a distance. The powerful rancher whose trembling hand had started everything. Now he looked vulnerable and small. Human. Dr. Cruz showed Sophie the readouts from his neural scans. The parasite was visible as bright spots in the imaging. Each day those spots were shrinking as the medication did its work. But some damage had already occurred. The parasites had destroyed clusters of neurons in his motor cortex. He would need physical therapy to regain full control of his left arm. But he was alive. He would recover. That was what mattered. Over the following days, Sophie fell into a new routine. She worked in the laboratory during the day. In the evenings, she would visit the medical bay to check on Marcus's progress. Dr. Cruz seemed to enjoy having someone interested in the details of treatment. She explained the protocols and the challenges. Sophie learned more about parasitology and neurology than she had ever expected. She found it fascinating. The complexity of the human brain, the elegance of the parasitic organism's survival strategy, the precision required to treat infection without causing more harm. This was applied science at its finest. On the 7th day of treatment, Marcus woke up. Dr. Cruz called Sophie immediately. She rushed to the medical bay. Craig Murphy was already there, standing outside the treatment room. He looked exhausted but relieved. He shook Sophie's hand and thanked her repeatedly. Without her, Marcus would be dead. Craig said this with complete sincerity. Sophie did not know how to respond. She had just been doing her job. Observing and analyzing. Anyone could have done the same. But Craig disagreed. Most people had not noticed anything wrong. Most people had been too busy or too distracted. Sophie had paid attention when others looked away. That made all the difference. Dr. Cruz invited Sophie into the treatment room. Marcus was sitting up in bed. He looked weak and pale. The tremor in his left arm was visible, but his eyes were clear and focused. He smiled when Sophie entered. His speech was slightly slurred but understandable. He said he had heard all about the intern who had saved his life. He wanted to meet her properly. Sophie approached the bed nervously. She introduced herself. Marcus thanked her. He said he owed her everything. Sophie felt her face flush. She was not good with gratitude or praise. She mumbled something about just doing what needed to be done. Marcus laughed. Even weak and recovering, his presence was commanding. He said that was exactly the kind of person he needed in his organization. Someone who did what needed to be done regardless of obstacles or doubt. He asked Sophie about her work, her goals, her plans after the internship ended. Sophie answered honestly. She loved research. She wanted to continue studying xenobiology, maybe eventually lead her own projects. Marcus listened carefully. Then he made her an offer that would change everything.